I should unmute that. There we go.
Hello, everyone.
Everything's probably a little bit too loud. Just got to tweak it a bit. But yeah, hello.
Hello. Get
Uh,
away? Are we?
yeah, we're on now. Everything's all right. I'm just tweaking audio volumes because you know how it works. You never everything's perfect, especially with audio. Audio when it comes to stream production is the bane of every streamer, making sure that everything's balanced correctly. But
Just like listening to your Australian accent. Oh, good.
yeah, I'm just checking everything. Everything looks good. All right, you ready to go? Go, Cat. It's up to you now.
Okay, folks. A class from the Rambo Academy. Familiar with who I am? Oh, this is the fourth time I've done this class for Greg, but you also know me because I play in his Aspergenesis game where I play Petrosinus and I play Young Turtle in the monthly Hearts of Wulin game. I will introduce myself briefly, and then I'm going to talk about what I'm going to do in the class, and then I'm going to launch into things because we've only got an hour. If you are a subscriber, I believe that you can ask questions live. And if you're one of my Patreon supporters, you know that there is a room set up for you on the Discord channel right now for you to ask questions in. So I am Cat Rambo. I am the author of about 200 short stories. I've got a couple novels. I've got 5 collections. I've got 2 novels coming out next year. And in terms of being on hybrid author, I'm about as hybrid as you can be because I have small press novels. Next year, I have the first of 3 books coming out with Tor Macmillan. And then I am also an indie writer in that I have a Patreon. That Patreon is hooked into my online writing school, the Rambo Academy for Wayward Writers. And it's not just me, it's some instructors like Shauna McGuire, Ann Leckie, Fran Wild, Rachel Swirsky, and a bunch of other very cool folk. If you support me on Patreon, you get access to the school, you get access to the Rambo server Crit Club, where you can exchange critiques with other fantasy and science fiction writers. So let me get to the meat of this class. So what I've been doing with these classes is often use them to test something out. And I wanted to do a class that I've been thinking about for quite some time, which has sort of grown out of conversation with my spouse, who is a coder. If you have ever ordered Starbucks on your phone, he has led the teams that did that for both the Android and Apple version. And so, but he also is a science fiction writer. He has one published short story that came out in Daily Science Fiction called Quick as Quarks. And we joke that sometimes he comes to me and says, I have an idea for a story. And I say, oh, that's odd. I have an idea for a software app. And then we both laugh hollowly and go away from each other. I do think, we both think that there are a lot of overlaps between coding and writing, that there are a lot of similarities of practice. And so what I wanted to do was talk about some of them and give you some stuff that you can use in your writing. And one of the things that I want to emphasize as I'm talking about this is what I'm giving you are tools, not rules. They're not things where you must apply this, and if you don't, you've written a shitty story. And I will say that anytime anybody is telling you, do this rule, and if you don't do it, you're writing a shitty story, I would be wary of that person. Because the fact is that writing process differs greatly from person to person, and it's even going to differ for you in different points in your life. The time when you have a lot of folks, go ahead and ask a question, Coven Guy. I don't mind going ahead and answering it. And now I've forgotten what I was saying. Oh God, someone remind me because I've gotten totally lost. I'm sorry. With coding and writing, they are both processes where you have Oh, be wary of hard rules. That's it. Okay, so if anybody says hard rules, just don't. They're wrong. And your job as a writer is to try lots of stuff, find the stuff that works for you, and then do that lots, right? Find the things that make you productive and happy in producing good stuff, and do those. And anytime there's some rule that is getting in the way of things, discard that rule because it's not worth keeping. So these are tools. These are things where if you are stuck, if you're wrestling with a story, if you don't know where to go next, hopefully some of these maxims that we're going to go through in this next hour are things that will be useful to you. They're things that you can pull out and apply. Okay. So software and stories are basically writing a story and writing a piece of software are very similar, that in each case you are creating something that produces a thing. And so with a story, it delivers an experience for the reader. And with a piece of software, it delivers basically an experience for the user, or some service for the consumer, or something like that. And so both stories and software have certain things. They have that consumer/reader. And that consumer/reader is either using the interface in the software and deciding which buttons to pick, or as a reader, they are supplying things. So when you, the writer, say house, that reader is immediately supplying a house in their head, right? And the house that they're supplying in their head may not be the same house that's in your head. In fact, I'd be highly surprised if it were identical. Hey, let me look at the question. Yes. And I think it's perfectly fine to hate to read your own stories, but you've got to, what I would do is I would read a lot. I would read great stories and I would try to copy some of them and do that as an exercise. That's one thing that I would do. I would also absolutely keep writing, because that's one of the ways that you get rid of the dross, is you sort of burn through it in the process of writing. And the third thing is find a writing group that you can swap critiques with. Find a group where, because one of the things that's very valuable about critiques is for you to be doing critiques, because it makes you articulate your theories of fiction. So those are the three things that I would suggest. Okay. So let's talk a little bit more about how stories and software are the same. But I do want to point out that one difference is usually with software, you know better what you want the software to do and how it's going to do it. Things are a bit more codified usually than they are with stories, particularly if you're someone who sits down and pants their way into the story. And if you're not familiar with that expression, we talk about writing by the seat of one's pants, just sitting down and writing and seeing where the writing goes. Okay. Okay, I'm trying to keep an eye on my Patreon window. So Patreon people, if you are watching this, the Discord server is a room called Classroom, and you can ask questions in there. Okay. All right. So one of the concepts that we have in software development is design patterns. And design patterns are pretty much based on the fact that over and over the same problems come up in software. And it isn't efficient to sort of be reinventing the wheel all the time. And in fact, they are a little bit like blueprints that you can customize. I thought he did, Saad. I thought he had a couple different links. I'm not quite sure why they're not popping up.
Yeah, I'm trying to find them, but I'll just grab it from Google.
Yeah,
it'll be easier.
Yeah. Okay.
So, there we go.
Oh, there we go. And so another, so design patterns are these solutions, right? And it's just, like if you, let's say shopping carts on a website are a good example of a design pattern. You don't want to have to do a shopping cart from scratch every time, right? What you're going to do is you're going to go find some basically some code you can copy, and you're going to cut and paste it and tweak it for your own design. So there are design patterns that work in fiction. And to me, I wanted to point to some, and I'm going to describe them in terms of the problem first, and then I'm going to tell you what I think the design pattern is. Okay, and so the first thing is, what if you have a story and your story lacks either a beginning or an ending? And it has to have one or the other, hopefully. If you have neither, that's a completely different problem. But if you have a beginning and an ending, you have something that you can use in a design pattern, which is that beginnings and endings usually reflect each other. That, in fact, you will notice if you watched Game of Thrones all the way through, it starts with Ned Stark and his children and the wolves. And then, of course, what does it end with? Sort of the ghost of Ned Stark or Ned Stark's memory and the wolves and the children, right? And so if you are stuck for a beginning, but you have an ending, go look at it and think about what sort of scene would set that up. Similarly, if you're not sure what's happening in the ending, go look at your beginning, because your beginning is introducing three things, right? Your beginning is introducing character. Your beginning is introducing the world, the setting, and it's introducing the conflict. And at the end of the story, all three of those things are going to appear again, because the conflict will have been resolved. The characters will probably be there, and it's still going to be taking place in that world. So those things. Yeah, if you don't have a beginner and change your name to George Lucas, it's probably a reasonable way to do it. But you have, like whenever you're writing a story, if you have any chunk of it, the characters, you probably know what the problem is that's facing them, and the setting. And if you don't know those, you've got to just keep trying to accrete pieces of it until they begin to shape for you. But that's one of your algorithms, right? You're stuck for your beginning, you're stuck for your ending. Well, look at its corollary. Look at this other side of the story and see what it produces. And one of the things that you can often do that's very effective is to show things from the beginning that are transformed by the ending. Let's say, for example, a story that begins with a freshly painted tavern sign. The young tavern owner is putting the final touches on the centaur bar servant that's, I don't know, whatever that's on the sign. Anyway, so they're painting it. It's new, it's fresh, the inn is new. And then we have the story, and over the course of the story, there's war, there's slaughter, there's explosions. And so at the end, a perfectly good end would be to be back at that inn, but now see the sign all bullet marked and pock marked with arrows sticking out of it, or and smoked, and perhaps the house, the inn is not totally standing. That will make things feel as though they've come full circle. Whenever you make things feel as though they've come full circle, it has a feeling of completion. It makes it feel as though the story is complete. So there's one of your basic algorithms. Okay. Similarly, another basic, here's one of the possible problems is, I don't know what to do next, right? You've written and you're just like, I don't know what to do next. I have them in spot X and they're all just standing around talking, and I'm not sure. So in that case, the design pattern that you're looking at is, I've taken from what we call Freytag's triangle, and I've talked about it in the classes on here before, but it's that idea that basically as time progresses in the story, tension rises, right? That is just, and then until we hit the moment that things come to a conclusion, and then tension drops. So we've got this kind of weird truncated triangle. But the movement of tension in a story is always upward. It can kind of sag a little little bit. You got to go up and down a tiny bit, but it's got to basically be upward. So the fact that that tension needs to be moving upward gives you an answer. What to do next? Well, what can you do that complicates things? What can you do that raises the tension? What can you do that makes the stakes higher? What can you do that introduces a deadline or a complication or makes, where before it was just the village at stake and now it's the whole city, right? How can you make the tension level higher? Because that is what you should do next. I hope that makes sense. All right. And so again, like what I was saying about rules, do I mean that you always have to always have the tension rising? The answer is no. I mean, particularly in a longer work, you may want periods where there's a kind of brief lull. You may want periods where they're getting a chance to catch their breath and you get to see the forest of Lothlorien and how beautiful it is, right? There may be a point where you want to lull them into a sense of false security so you can then have, things burst out of their chests or whatever, so you can play with that. But the motion is always overall going to be upward. And I'm going to argue that when we talk about structures that are sort of 100% true, there isn't anything that's 100% true. This one comes pretty close, though. And that's for a basic psychological reason, which is that you keep making the reader want to keep reading, right? You keep giving them more reasons to want to keep reading. You keep making things even more tense, right? You keep wanting them flipping the pages even faster. Okay. All right. Let me mark off the 2 design patterns I have spoken of. So I call this coming full circle and rising tension. Sorry. And so I've got, there's 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. I got about 10 of these. And if you want all of them, you'll have to probably take the full length course, which I'm thinking will happen in December. Anyway, so another one is, I don't quite know what the problem is or how one would define it, but it would be, the story feels scattered or the story feels loose. The story, and so what design pattern do you want to look to? I'm naming this one Chekhov's gun, and that is after the maxim that Anton Chekhov had, which was about playwriting, which is that if there is a gun on the wall in the first act, by the last act, it must have gone off. And so look for the Chekhov's guns that you have placed in your writing and make them pay off. If they are in Delhi 2 or 3 times over the course of the story, make the fact that they're in a deli somehow significant to the story. Make, in fact, there be a plot point that hinges on the fact that they're in a deli and have access perhaps to some food item or some resource that they wouldn't normally. If you mention the mailman or the mail carrier, Ms. Clark, and her pepper spray, well, at some point over the course of the story, Ms. Clark needs to either use that pepper spray or brandish that pepper spray or do something with that pepper spray, right? You have mentioned it once. If you go back and you look for these random things and you keep and you bring them back in this way, you tie them together, it ends up feeling much more intentional and feels much more pulled together. And one of the analogies that I like to use is, it's a little bit like a wicker basket. I don't know if you've ever woven a basket, but when you're weaving it, you have all this just sort of stuff that's shooting off into, well, not shooting, sticking up. And so you weave it into the basket. You take it and you put it back down into the body of the basket. You make it part of the basket and not just a sort of loose extraneous end that's just sort of leading the eye nowhere. So if the complaint is that your story isn't feeling coherent, that isn't feeling satisfying, that is feeling loose or unstructured, this is a way that you can create patterns in it that will make it feel structured, will make it feel more deliberate. And so this is something that this is a rewriting skill often. This is something that when you are looking at your first draft, you may want to go back and say, where are all the places that I put these Chekhov's guns? Where are the places where I put something that I can now use? And, I want to stress, this came up recently in a class that I did at over the weekend. Really, it's important to give yourself permission to write crap. And part of giving yourself permission to write crap is developing your skill with rewriting. So you know that you can trust yourself to rewrite that crap into something good. And part of learning to rewrite well is learning to find these pieces that your unconscious mind seeds in. Like you're writing the deli scene. You don't know why you put that woman with her poodle on the bench next to him. Well, why not see if you can do something with her or the poodle? Make them come back. Maybe they give him advice. Maybe they complicate things. Maybe the poodle explodes. I don't know. But use it. Go and look and see what you have that you have placed. So, look, what are the guns? And so in some ways, if we really want to get all codey with this, we can think of this as a design factory, right? And a design factory is an object for creating other objects. Okay, and so what you are doing when you're putting all this sort of random stuff in the story, the women with their poodles or whatever, is you are creating basically a factory object that you can reach into and pull out things that make the story feel more complete. You're creating resources for this story. I hope that made sense. Okay. So those are kind of like three biggies. Those are three big patterns, and I hope that that's helpful. And you'll notice, I think a lot of writers have maxims that go along those lines. I was talking to Mark Laidlaw, and he said one of my rules is if I don't know what to do next, I make them have sex, and then complications ensue as a result of that. And I'm like, yeah, actually, that's a pretty good rule. This is, again, not 100% of the time, but actually, particularly for a particular genre, it's quite apropos. So I thought that was funny. All right. So what are some other design patterns? This is here again. This is another thing where the story feels unsatisfying, where the story feels undeveloped. And here, the design pattern is something that I would call the rule of three. And the rule of three is ingrained in us, from fairy tales. I mean, think about it. The three little bears, the three little pigs, not the three little bears, the three bears, Goldilocks and the three bears, the three little pigs. There's always like three sons, three princesses, or some multiple of three. We expect things to come in threes. And so when something is mentioned twice, then to some sense, even whether we sort of consciously realize it or not, we are always waiting for that third reference. And if that third reference does not come, the story does not feel satisfying. So here, the story feels unsatisfying. Well, go through. Are there things that you have mentioned twice that can be brought back a third time? Particularly in that final scene, right? That sort of that cork on the bottle, that stopper. Here's another one. Problem is that the character is unlikable. The character is just like, you're just like, this guy. And of course, the problem with an unlikable character is why should the reader keep reading if they don't care what happens to that character, if they don't like them? right? You want them to like the character. So one basic way to do that, one design pattern, give them something to care for. Give them a pet. Give them a plant. Give them a raggle-taggle orphan dragged in from the street who supplies snappy pattern and has a heart of gold. How do you make a character likable? You show them loving something. You show them caring for something. You show them taking care of something that couldn't take care of itself. All of those things. And one of the reasons that this is a good practice is that that thing that your character loves then becomes a point of vulnerability. And so go back to that question of rising tension. Well, what can you do to make the tension rise? Well, does your character have any points of vulnerability? Can someone kidnap the raggle-taggle orphan? Can somebody do away with that thing that they love? They take the plant, they run away down the sidewalk, little spider plant under their arms. All right, so that's one, right? Characters unlikable. Give them something. Here's another problem. You don't know what the character's going to do. You have your character, you have their problem, and you are just now they're sitting on the front porch drinking lemonade, and you have no idea how to get them off down to the bazaar in order to launch the plot. Well, here's what to do with this case is figure out what your character wants. This is super important, and you should know this whenever you're writing. In fact, you should know this for every character in the story. What do they want? Kurt Vonnegut, hallowed be his name, greatest of many writers, says that what is it, something like know what every character wants, even if it's just a glass of water. Well, why is it important to know what they want? Well, there are two major reasons. One is that tells you what they might do next. What are they going to do next? They're going to do something that in their mind moves them towards fulfilling that want, or positions them better to fulfill that want, or somehow advances them towards getting that want. Perhaps they even know it's futile. But often, what do you want? You don't know what the character's going to do? Well, what do they want? How are they going to go? What crazy scheme are they going to come up with next? Okay. And the second reason that it's great to know what a character wants, and this is when you are filtering your narrative through their perspective, right? When they're a point of view character. Perhaps you are doing first person point of view, or perhaps you are doing third person attached. In either case, all of the world is filtered through that character's perceptions, and those perceptions are shaped by what that character wants. If you are hungry, you notice the food in the room. If you are not, maybe not so much. If you are tired and sleepy, you notice how comfortable that couch looks, right? If you are desperate to escape, you notice that the jailer has a set of keys dangling from their belt, right? What you notice reflects what you want, or what the character notices reflects what they want. Point of view is one of your great tools for describing a character. Don't tell us that they're greedy. Describe things through their eyes in a way that shows us that they're greedy. Use words that convey it. Don't say they were greedy. That's slightly inartistic, in my opinion. All right. I'm going to pause for a minute and take a little drink and ask if there's questions yet about anything that I have said. I'm going through this much faster than I thought I would. This is one of the problems with teaching new classes, is that you prepare and you always hope that one of two things will happen. Either you will be a genius and it will be just like the class will end on the dot, and sometimes that happens, or more likely you are overly prepared and you have a bunch of stuff, and so you're kind of like shoving stuff in at the last minute, trying to get it to come to a graceful end. Or, as looks to be happening with this class, you find yourself running through everything that you have prepared and thinking about what you're going to be doing for the last 15 minutes or so. But we will open it up for questions. I think you guys know from the past that I'm happy to ask about questions that aren't covered by the class. All right, so let's talk about a couple other things. In fact, I just have three more, and then I'd be curious to know if anybody has design patterns like this that you can think of your own. One of them is, and this is again the idea of a story not feeling satisfying. I would say, can you use this design pattern, karma in action? And that is where you have somebody do something that is reprehensible in some way, something that somehow invokes bad karma, and then you show them suffering as a result. This is, I think, such a classic trope, right? Whenever you have a bully, right? Kind of early on in the story, you show them bullying, right? And so you know that by the end, they will have gotten theirs, because that's how we think of stories. One of the things that's really interesting to me about the show House of Games, if you're familiar with it, which has Kevin Spacey as a politician, is that in fact in the very first episode, you see him, and I hope I don't spoil this for anybody. I apologize if I do, and I hope, and this is actually a little triggery, so be aware. But he kills a dog, basically, that has been hit by a car and puts it out of its misery. But it is an incredibly ruthless action. And so do we see him sort of reap the whirlwind? Well, yeah, we do definitely see him over the course of the season, see him get affected by other people turning that same ruthlessness on him. And so it's very interesting. It gets set up. So Common Guy is asking, which do I think is more immersive when reading something like a choose your own adventure, first or second person? Boy, I think it's a really interesting question. And one of the things about second person, right, that sort of that you do this, you do that, is that there is an innate resistance on the part of the reader. There is it sort of like you say, you do this, and the reader's kind of like, well, no, I don't, right? You know, like one of my favorites is somebody wrote to me at one point and said, "Dear Cat Rambo, if you're like me, you're a," just in like a set of adjectives. It was like, if you could list someone totally undifferent, totally different from me, you could not have put it together more carefully. I was like, no, of course that's not me. So that's one of the problems with second person. If you can break through that, and I think that's an art form in and of itself, and I think kind of writing second person stories is kind of worthy of a masterclass in and of itself. If you can break through that, I think it's going to be slightly more immersive, mainly because while first person, right, is that voice talking to you, it's often that voice talking to you. It's not you talking, it's them talking. Oh, yeah. So Game Master Vault is saying, I think part of writing a good villain and making them more is allowing the reader players to agree with them as their justification, just not the means they go about it. I think absolutely. And I think that when villains who think they're doing the right thing are so much more interesting than the ones that have sort of fallen off the evil overlord assembly line. If you are familiar with a wonderful series, in fact, let me put it in the chat window. It's called The Dagger and the Coin, and it is by Daniel Abraham. I mention this series a lot because I just love it so much. And Daniel Abraham is part of James S.A. Corey, the team that does The Expanse. This is a fantasy. It's 5 volumes, and it's a very rich world. But the villain starts as a character that you enjoy, right? He's a point of view character, and he is bullied and pushed around. And then you see him sort of get haplessly swept up by fate and caught up in political games beyond his ken, so to speak. And then you eventually see him make an absolutely horrendous, horrible, awful decision, which basically a horrible war crime. And you understand why he thinks it's the only thing he can do. And that's the moment where then stuff starts to sort of go off the rails. And you can see him then after that, he keeps making decisions, but they are more and more about self-interest and more about sort of hiding the fact that he's become the bully that he used to get tormented by. And it's just fascinating. So I highly recommend that in terms of a really great villain. Oh, you have a fantasy choose your own adventure in its outline stages. I think that I think it's fascinating. And I would suggest that one of the platforms that you look at is a company called Choice of Games. Choice of Games is actually writing interactive fiction right now, or they are publishing interactive fiction. And it is kind of that sort of choose your own adventure HyperCard, if you are old enough to remember HyperCard, which I do. But it's also got a basic scripting language in it, so you can keep track of variables and stuff like that. It is a really cool language. Oh yeah, NPCs to the characters, totally different story. They will lie. There's no guarantee. I would like to think my characters have learned that, or at least my players have learned that. But they've also, as a kind of example of Chekhov's gun, we had at one point an encounter. This is my D&D game where they ran into a room where there was an animate table. And that table, hi, John, if you're watching, that table kicked the paladin's ass. I mean, just really did like two or three criticals in a row. And so for a long time after that, I could make them super paranoid whenever I was describing a room and spent just a little extra time on describing the furniture. And so it's a little bit, it's like that in a book, right? Your reader's always like, well, why are they spending that much time on the furniture? What are they putting in? Oh, cool. Son's put the books in. Yeah.
Sorry.
So come on, check out it's Choice of Games, and it's worth checking out. They've been doing a lot of really interesting stuff, and they might, if you have a choose your own adventure style novel, that might be something that you could put out through them.
Yeah, I just put an image of the books up. But with choose your own adventure, I feel like being in the first person, being told that you do that, it feels like you're being, as you said, forced in that path. And also with choose your own adventures, you want to physically put the player in that location so that it feels like that they are that person. And a lot of people, when they imagine it, they'll be physically imagining themselves there, and saying just they do that, it kind of forces them on a certain path physically, which might
absolutely
distract or make it awkward for them. That's just my opinion, but
no, I think that's absolutely right. And I think, obviously it's going to vary from person to person.
Yeah.
Some people are going to be like, "Ooh, I love second person." My theory is that everybody has one good second person story in them, and that you should write that one and then never write another. But I have actually broken that by writing 2 or 3 myself. So who knows? All right. So karma in action, right? This is another design pattern, and this is something that we expect. And, another way to think of these design patterns might be to go to the website TV Tropes, which you may be familiar, which talks about kind of like, here are tropes, here are structures that keep popping up in stories. Like here in steampunk stories usually have, X and Y and Z as zeppelins and automatons and, that sort of thing. This is a two-edged sword, right? Because you don't want to be predictable. You don't want to do what everybody else is doing. But at the same time, there is this sort of storytelling shorthand that goes on, right? That if you see zeppelins, we're like, oh, it's steampunk. So just be aware that your reader, as I said at the beginning, that act of collaboration, when they're imagining that house, it can be a pretty weird house. And it's up to you to supply the details that sort of pin down the things that you need pinned down. If it is important that it is a 2-story house, then they must be given enough clues to construct a 2-story house. Otherwise, you will get to the point where it becomes important that it's a two-story house, and they will suddenly go, "Oh, fuck! I thought it was sorry. Oh God, I apologize for swearing. Um, I didn't think it was a two-story house. I thought it was a like single level or whatever." And the thing about that is, you remind them that they're reading, and that is really the cardinal sin for a writer, because whenever you remind a reader that they are reading, they are losing that delicious immersion that we come to books for, right? You are making them remember that they're reading, and they're no longer, lost in that alternate world. Okay. All right. So another story is unsatisfying possible design pattern is to go through and look for expressed wishes and desires, things that people, particularly sidekicks or NPCs, or like the people that are sort of wandering around the background of stories. If you can give them tiny story arcs where they get what they want, again, that's going to feel very satisfying. Now, can you do this in a short story? To some extent. Can you do this in a flash story? Probably not. Can you do this in a novel? Yes. And you absolutely should, because this is, again, one of the things that makes a novel feel like things are tied together. That makes it feel like you did everything on purpose. And so your job, honestly, in writing a novel is not to do everything on purpose in the draft. Your job is to go through and make it look through the revision as though you did it all on purpose. And I don't know if I can stress that hard enough, because over and over, the thing that paralyzes people is the idea that they have to write genius. They have to write a good story. And certainly I've fallen prey to that. Like every once in a while, somebody will ask me to write a story, and I often have a hard time writing them, because what I do is I sit down and I know that I have to write something sellable, right? They've asked me for a short story, and I want to write a story that's not going to have them sort of like bouncing it back and going, "Are you on crack?" And so I will procrastinate on those. I will put certain boundaries on myself. And so I try not to do that. And so sometimes I switch stuff around. I will be like, okay, they want a story. Oh, look, I have one that's half started that I can use for this. That's great. That's perfect. All right. So expressed wishes. Okay. And so my last one of these is, my story doesn't feel deep enough, or doesn't feel, again, tied together enough. And I'm going to say, in that case, one of the things that I suggest you do is look for the symbols. Just as you go through and look for the Chekhov's gun, go through and look to see, are there things that seem to symbolize other things? And if you are having trouble with that, one of the books I have, which I would grab if I was not tethered to my laptop by earbuds, it's called like the Penguin Dictionary of Symbols. And so sometimes it is useful to go through and just see, is there some deep meaning to roses? Okay, well, can you use that in what you're writing? Ooh, now it looks like you did that on purpose. Okay, awesome. Okay, Game Master Vault is asking, what are a couple good techniques for turning tropes into something more unique? Tropes are for good reason, but need to be made unique to sell a story to a reader. Yeah, I think that's an excellent question. And what I will say is something that I say to people when they think about writing stories for anthologies, which is, don't pick the first idea that comes to mind. Don't pick the second or third. Go further, right? Pick the fourth idea, because your first few ideas will be sort of the stuff that's churned up, kind of the flotsam from the sea of generic things. It's an improv rule, right? If you're doing improv comedy, this is one of the things that they suggest. It's because if you get past the first few easy ideas, you start getting into interesting stuff. If you're doing anthologies, those first few ideas that you have, I can guarantee you other people will have it too. Okay.
Just want to make sure, Kat. Sorry, Kat.
Yeah,
just want to make sure that book is the right one I put it on the stream. Is that the one you're talking about? Two symbols. Is that the
Um,
Penguin reference book?
Yes, that is.
Okay, great.
And that's something like that symbol stuff is something where we talk about turning tropes into something more unique. Go through and look and see, can you take the symbols and do something interesting with them? Can you throw some random collisions in there? Can you mash stuff up together in an interesting way? But don't use the sort of the generic stuff that gets handed to you by popular culture, right? That Western saloon that everybody gives you. Well, give us some interesting stuff, give us something unexpected. Give us the smell of the sarsaparilla that got spilled because somebody just ordered a big glass of it unexpectedly, or just give us some details, some sensory stuff that makes us feel like you were there, rather than you just sort of been like, well, let me imagine a Western saloon. Other questions? So, these are examples of design patterns. Let me see if I had other stuff in my notes that I wanted to talk about, but please do feel free to ask questions. The other thing that I wanted to talk about is that I do think with coding and writing being similar, is that debugging is very similar. That you do, for example, when you're rewriting a novel, and I've noticed this, like just as when you're debugging a big product, when you make changes at the beginning, right, that sort of you have to sort of push those bubbles all the way through, and they affect everything that comes after it. So when you're doing a rewrite of a novel, often, like if you're changing stuff at the beginning, you do also, push it through, and it bubbles, it changes through stuff. Bum, bum, bum. Oops, I'm sorry, I'm using the wrong mouse to try to maneuver stuff. No supporting Jason. Yeah, I think absolutely. Music is in a way, an abstract notation, and I think that's all of this is good stuff. And I think the reason that we started talking about it is that, and I don't know if folks know what I mean when I talk about a flow state, but the flow state is that when you're just you're in the groove and the stuff is coming, and when you are writing it in the flow state, it is just absolutely one of the best feelings in the world. And of course, when you're coding, you can get into that same groove, and they are both creative acts. They are both acts where you are arranging things and thinking about things and putting thought patterns down on the page. Yeah, and that's what we talk about. You're mentioning reverse engineering, and I think that is one of the things that I often tell my students, is that it is a great idea whenever you are reading something and you particularly love it, go back and figure out how they're doing it and copy it. Use it. I did this as Joe Abercrombie. Uses transitions in one way, and I was reading his book, and I was like, "Oh, that's genius!" And I went and I wrote a story where I specifically explored how to do exactly that. I'm reading a great book right now. I'm halfway through it. I brought it down because I wanted to recommend it to people. But it's Tamsin Muir's Gideon the Ninth, and it is just, and that's Tamsyn Muir. I may not be saying that correctly. Muir. Let me put it in chat.
Yeah, but I'll get that up in a second.
Okay.
Gideon of the Ninth.
And I think she is Australian, but I'm not sure. But this is a new book that just came out this month. And I'll read you. Charles Strauss's blurb is: lesbian necromancers explore a haunted Gothic palace in space. Decadent nobles vie to serve the deathless emperor. Skeletons! That's of Charles Strauss. And then Warren Ellis said, this crackling, inventive, and riotous book from original voice is a genuine pleasure. Also, the author is clearly insane. And it's just a really wonderful, wonderful book. It's like Swords Point met Gormenghast, and then they had a bastard child that got raised by a space opera. It is just crazy wonderful. And so one of the things that I'll be doing after I finish reading this and enjoying the hell out of it is I'm going to go back and give it a second read. And at that point, I'm going to go back and be like, okay, so how exactly did she do this? There's a really interesting flavor to the relationships that I think is promising a love in, but it's keeping it super, super muted. And so I want to see how that plays out. Correct. And I want to go back and see, like, what exactly was it that is leading me to that conclusion? Because I may want to do that. I mean, who doesn't love a kind of hinted, muted love interest that somehow then all works out in the end, and you're like, oh, I'm so happy. Okay. Other question. We got about 7 minutes to go. I do think the other thing that you want to think about is, I mean, you can kind of, I talk about breaking it down. The story is a character with a problem in a setting, and then what happens. But the characters are like variables, and what you put inside them, the person that you choose to occupy that character slot is going to greatly affect the story. If you have a basic plot where it's a woman meets a werewolf, well, let's say the woman is an elderly grandmother who hates dogs. That's going to be a very different story than, say, the goth high schooler student who wants to become a werewolf herself. They are different characters. They have different wants. And so they're going to create different stories. And so, we can think about stories in terms of formulas. And certainly people are very fond of coming up with things like, there's only 7 stories, or there's only 3 stories, there's only 27 stories, or whatever, whatever makes it for a good BuzzFeed article. And yes, there are a lot of similar stories, but they're like these little design patterns, and it's what the data that you stick into them, it's the things that you make the different variables hold that ends up making them distinct. And so, yeah, you have those TV tropes, you have patterns that are predictable, you pick interesting stuff to stick into those slots, and that's what makes it interesting. Find unexpected stuff, find stuff that really shouldn't fit in that slot, find stuff that has never been stuck in that slot before. One of the things I love about this decade is suddenly we have all these characters who are queer or non-binary or polysexual or just they're othered, or they have a disability, or they're just like characters are doing wonderful kind of weird, wacky, amazing stuff and perspectives that have not been told before. Like Michelle Baker's Borderline, I think is just fabulous. All right. Questions about anything else? I'm going to take my last sip of water and hum Girl from Ipanema as you think of your last questions. I wanted to mention a couple of classes that are coming up. This Saturday, Doug Smith is doing a class, his second workshop on playing the short game, when this is about what happens when you sell a short story, what happens as far as working with the editor, what happens with rights, what happens with contracts. Yes. Awesome. And then also coming up next month, my friend Diane Morrison is going to give a really interesting class that I've been watching her work on called Writing in the Cracks. And it is about finding and making time for writing. And we hope that it will be super timely for those of you that are participating in NaNoWriMo and are going to engage in that. I want to point out that if you are interested in kind of learning more about this sort of stuff and participating in a community that's always talking about writing as well as exchanging cat pictures, please do check out my Patreon. Okay. And I think I'm about done, Saad. What do you think? Do we have any last minute? Oh, I should say this. Tune in tomorrow for, again, As for Genesis, I don't know exactly where we are because I was absent the game before, but last time I was absent for a game, I came back and they made me the ship captain, which I was not really happy about. So who knows what has happened this time?
That's why you never miss a game, because
It's why you never miss a game.
That's great.
And then Monday is also the Hearts of Wulin game is going.
Yeah, so you get to see what happens to the group after our falling out, and ending with Bai Xiaofeng getting stabbed by another party member.
Oh, that's right. I forgot he stabbed you.
Yes, while you were walking away, kind of annoyed that I stopped you from killing one of the heads of the Gallant family.
I really still feel that would have made things much simpler if I had just been allowed to kill him. But I understand that your character is more squeamish.
Well, it's all drama filled. There's reasons behind everything. It's great. That's what's so good about Wulin is that you set all these entanglements up, and you have to work on them and work around them, and it's amazing. It's a simple system, and it completely opens it up for the drama and role playing.
Game Master Vault suggesting I'm now the ship in S for Genesis, and that's within the realm of possibility.
Meld one, be one with the ship, become a sentient ship.
Oh, and people that have been following the saga of the space opera will be happy to know I just turned in the first set of edits, and we are on track, and we still don't know what the title is, but someday we'll know. There's that news.
Oh boy. So hopefully my production was okay.
No, it was terrific. That was awesome.
Literally working on it on the fly while things were happening. So we should say while you were doing this, Tomb 0816 followed the stream. Thank you very much. Espogenesis, what time is it, Kat? What do you know the session time?
I want to say it starts at 5:30 Pacific my time. I'm pretty sure
that's
that.
7 US Eastern, is that right? No, 6. I can't remember.
I've given up on translating it for people. Actually, let me look at Greg.
Just double check for us if you can. That'd be great.
Well, he should say on his Twitter, because he's
8:30 Eastern. There you go.
8:30 Eastern. So it is 5:30 Pacific time. Yes, and we will go, and who knows what will happen. I love it. I realized the other day that game's been going for, I think, 2 years now, which I think is just crazy.
Wow, it's really been going that long? I feel like it's maybe a year and a bit, but 2.
I don't know, because I was looking at how many episodes we had done, and if we're doing 2 a month, it seemed a vast number. I may have miscalculated. But
crazy.
Who knows? All right. Well, I'm going to go prepare dinner for my family. Thank you, folks, for tuning in, because it's been a lot of fun, and I hope it was reasonably coherent.
Yep, thank you, everybody. And I'll put us back over to the little lovely splash screen, and I'll set up a raid and all that. Kat, once again, thank you. It was a really good stream.
Awesome.
And yeah, hopefully see you for more of this Academy of Wayward Riders.
Thank you, guys. Take care.